Astra nuts. Welcome back for our first in-person scientist interview since 2020, I think. So I am here with Austin Clyde. Austin Clyde is a computational scientist at the Data Science and Learning Division of Argonne National Laboratory, a Ph.D. student in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Chicago, and a visiting research fellow of Science, Technology, and Society at the Harvard Kennedy School. Did I get all of those correct?
Yes, those are
I wrote them down so I could get them all. His research asks how AI, computing, and algorithmic thinking can improve science, society, and democracy. With work critical to new drug discovery, including COVID-19 research, Austin is passionate about translating computing developments to novel scientific approaches and vice versa, to improve science and produce tangible scientific results. Recently, Austin's research has also focused on the ethics of artificial intelligence, asking, how can we know when models are actually improving something? How can democratic institutions channel algorithmic developments through the public? Social integration, deliberation, and more generally, feeling at home in the world are actually decreasing under the current regime of AI thought. So, can you tell me a little bit more about that last piece, how feeling at home in the world and social integration are actually decreasing in a world of AI?
Yeah, so, well, let me give you first a little bigger picture of, how we might think about just being in the world, right? So how are we all in society and democracy? And one of my favorite kind of accounts from this comes from two philosophers, Christina Lafont from Northwestern and Thomas Cristiano. And the way they think about these things is to say, well, there's two parts to any political system. There's the part everyone thinks about, which is finding the right answers, right? Like we expect our officials to, figure out how traffic really should flow. How should it? I don't know, but we think that we have these experts who do. But there's an important second component to political systems, which is forming a unified social body, a polis is where kind of the word even originates from. And so when we think about kind of what does it mean to feel at home in the world, well, it's like, as Thomas Cristiano writes, it's like knowing the rules of a game you're playing. So when we think about something like computing, like AI, like our Twitter feeds, like Facebook algorithms, like ads that somehow overhear your conversations, we start to lose a sense of being at home in the world. Because there's all these things happening of which we have kind of no mental map of. We kind of don't know the rules of. We often hear the joke of like, oh, I think my Alexa or Amazon thing is listening.
Oh, I know my iPhone is listening because walking home the other night, my wife and I passed a bunch of people in like Regency gowns. And we're like, I wonder if that's the Bridgerton thing. And it was, because we asked, because we're nosy. And then we were chatting, we're like, where do you even get Regency gowns to like that's not a common cosplay. Like, are all of these custom? Today, like literally this morning, on my Facebook feed is an ad, 12 places to get Regency attire in Chicago for the Bridgerton thing. And I was like, wow, that's hyper-specific and targeted. So yeah, it was a little unsettling.
Right. So these are the types of things I wonder about as we increase the technology in our lives. Is well, at what point do we start to lose sense of the way things work? And I don't mean this in a kind of retroactive, like let's go back to old sensibility sense. No, what I mean is how can we think about just the rules of our daily lives and to kind of know them? Like how do we? It doesn't even have to be technological. I mean, a lot of people in this country, for example, feel alienated from just the basic political system because they feel like they might not have a voice or something. And this is part of not knowing the rules. And so to the extent that AI, to the extent that computing might start to alienate us from the science or from basic things like the internet communication, I'm interested in, well, first of all, how do we understand this phenomenon? And then kind of, are there things that we can do to remedy it or where is it coming from?
So I think it might be helpful to understand how artificial intelligence itself works. And assuming I've never taken a computer science class, what is artificial intelligence? Like the basics.
Right. So everyone, I think, is pretty familiar with this idea of pattern recognition. So, if I show you a couple triangles and they're all red, and I show you a couple circles and they're all blue, and then I say, what color is the next circle?
Probably blue.
It's probably blue. And that's an example of what the basic underlying thing of artificial intelligence does, which is you collect some data and you just try to guess what comes next from this data. So whether it be something more complicated, like maybe you have a bunch of resumes. You hired some people and you didn't hire others. It's just a pattern at the end of the day. The pattern's much more complicated, right? It's not just red circles and triangles. It's, strings of characters that, are formatted on this page that, we might be able to read and think about. But we feed into computers, and the computers apply kind of the same algorithms that we might kind of intuitively apply when we look at circles and squares.
But what if historically your company has, let's say, hiring practices that preference a specific demographic, say a specific race or gender? Would the computer incorporate that pattern as well?
Of course, it incorporates. So the thing about patterns, this is a bit philosophical, is, what is a pattern, right? Patterns are this thing that we perceive, we pick up on. But there's so many patterns that we don't pick up on and we don't perceive. And so one thing that we don't really know, and this is an area of AI research called explainable artificial intelligence, XAI is sometimes abbreviated, is, what are those patterns that it's picking up on? And so, of course, we do know from various research studies that, of course, sexism is a pattern that's picked up. And it's picked up just like the red or green squares. And it's picked up. I don't know. The artificiality of the artificial intelligence, right, is the fact that it has no background assumptions, right? It has no sense of what is right, what is moral, what is good, what is bad. It comes with none of this. So when you simply say, do what we did, well, if you're bad people, it's going to do what you did quite badly.
Or it's going to do bad things quite well.
Right, or it's going to do bad things quite well. And so when we stand here today in 2022 and we all say sexism is really, really horrible, like, oh my God, we need to fix that. Like, why did we been doing this?
But if you give it hiring data back through the 60s...
It's going to act like the 60s person did. That's what the algorithms do. In the sense of the algorithms, it's functioning exactly as designed. And that's where then, there's different questions of, well, why are you using it? Right? But that's a different...
Well, to save time.
Right.
It's cheaper to get a computer to look at resumes than a human.
Exactly.
But I also have a question about how good these algorithms can get. So, for example, say hypothetically, although this completely happened, my friend's iPhone started identifying photos of her two dogs on her iPhone as dogs and put them in an album called Dogs. And it even recognized her two separate dogs as two separate breeds, which we thought was very impressive. However, while it correctly labeled her poodle mix as a poodle, which is pretty close.
Right.
Like, he was a mutt, but he's a poodle mutt. It did label her Cocker Spaniel as a Newfie, which is, slightly off.
Right.
So, how smart is artificial intelligence?
Well, I like to say that it depends on the type of problem and it depends on what it's used in. So, it's hard to say in general, but I would say it's not much smarter than a mob of people.
Oh dear.
Well, in the sense of if you took your dog through a walk through the park and you asked 5 people what kind of dog is this, and you average their answers together, that's probably roughly as accurate as it's going to be.
Okay.
And so I don't know. Would I be able to identify a dog breed if I saw one? Maybe some I would get right, but others I'd not.
Okay, so you wouldn't select for people who had their dogs and clearly know about dogs. You just...
Right, exactly. Well, because a lot of times, for especially image recognition, where is this data coming from? It's coming from massively
The CAPTCHAs?
Yeah, or those it comes from, and it comes from what's called web scraping. Web scraping is just kind of you go online, you enter in a couple search terms, and you just pull all that data. So it's whatever nonsense was in the caption of a photo online anywhere becomes the ground truth for that image.
So if somebody posts a caption of a old 1950s VW bug with the caption love of my life, that car has love and life as the keywords?
Precisely. And this is how a lot of biases do come up, though, in kind of different senses of AI. So, I mean, some of the biggest models that are most used, these are text generation models, like the ones you might hear about from OpenAI, like GPT-3 is thrown around, or the image recognition models. These are trained on gigantic data sets from the internet. And part of these is like data from Reddit, data from Flickr, data from Twitter, data from Wikipedia.
I completely get what you mean by mob of people now.
Yeah, it's an agglomeration of anyone who's said anything online's opinion.
So it's basically Twitch plays Pokemon, but with way higher stakes?
Yeah, well, I mean, the stakes are not high in and of themselves. The stakes are high because corporations, people of power, people who are making decisions are using them. Yeah. I mean, that's one thing I want to caution is that it's not like these things are deterministic in the world. Like, just because in the room behind us, maybe people might be making AI models, and, you know, we're in the CS department right now, right? Just because they're making them doesn't mean they have to be used. The amount of research, things people do, doesn't mean they need to be put in positions of power, such as in doing hiring for companies.
Yeah, I mean,
that's their own logic. That's the logic of something else happening, right?
There is a much different stakes with, I trained an AI to write a Simpsons episode, and I trained an AI to recruit our next generation of technical associates.
Exactly. And there's something completely different than that. I mean, and it's not even just recruit the next generation of technical associates. I mean, it's in American capitalism, in this meritocracy, it means actually a lot more, right? It's not just hiring. And that's what
Are we still pretending to be a meritocracy, or have we just like accepted the oligarchy / plutocracy that we've got?
Well, I mean, that's an open discussion. But I mean, I do think, though, in what you're saying, that there's a difference in scale to also think about. That there's a point at which it becomes predicting resumes to which it becomes the definition of a new modern middle class. And so that's a separate kind of question, right? I mean, the people who we hire in the kinds of mass software engineering roles are really forming the upper middle class of the modern American, political economy. So the question is like, well, hold on now. This is moving from a decision that was made across many different corporations by many different people in HR departments, done with sexism, racism, everything else stirred in the pot and mixed in. But well, now what happens when you have a few companies, maybe one or two, who create these kind of robo-hiring platforms that use AI, and they're just perpetuating those and deciding those. So there's a difference between these kinds of decision structures and between like AI, which is really like a software program that maybe one company writes and gives out to everyone else, deciding the kind of social structure that we live in. It's
not great.
Well, I mean, it doesn't have to be bad either, I think, but it's definitely not great as it's looking.
Yeah. I guess it's better depending on where you fit into that system.
So one part of my research that in this ethics area that I talk a lot about is this idea of awareness, of social consciousness, which is the following kind of thought of like, how do you realize you're being harmed? So if you think about all the harms you've experienced in your life, a lot of them you didn't realize until many years later. Yes. You look back and you're like, really that person was a real a-hole. And so what that took for you maybe to realize this was some sort of growth, some sort of interaction with another person, some kind of like awareness.
Not being a child anymore and realizing that people in authority are fallible.
Exactly. I mean, all these things come in and then you realize it. And then when you realize it, you gain some power.
Yeah.
And so one thing I really like about the whole AI discourse, which sounds kind of sick in its own way, is that it's, for what I'm seeing from the outside as kind of a researcher, as outside as I could be, is seeing people's awareness. So one thing that these robo-hiring platforms have allowed is people to actually fully grapple with the full extent to which how sexist and racist hiring has been. Because literally, it's like as if a child grew up in that house. And you look at how that child acts.
I'm reminded of the experiment where a company kind of trained a bot to be a 12-year-old girl on Twitter, I guess. I can't remember what company it was, but within 24 hours, she was a neo-Nazi or something.
Right. Well, so what I mean is like, we're now acutely aware of the kind of discrimination, and the particular robo-hiring example I keep bringing up is a well-studied example from Amazon in like around 2018, 2019. And the best part about the whole story, let me tell it, I guess. So Amazon created a hiring algorithm. They started using it. So they were using this algorithm they made for 1 year. The engineers were like, wow, guys, we did it. Like, woo, guys, I say, because most of them were guys. And so they used this algorithm for actually a whole year. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until the end of the year, and this algorithm was screening resumes. So whether or not you got a call back was the algorithm said yes or no. After 1 year, they realized, guys, we haven't seen any women come through.
Yep.
And
have they seen any people of color come through?
That they didn't even mention in the study. Which I think we all know the answer was no. It took them 1 year to realize it. And I think that's a really important thing about this, because what I find fascinating in this whole study is after 1 year, they realized in that moment how sexist they really were.
Yeah, because they had trained the AI.
And not only had they trained it, but they had used it for a year.
And not noticed.
I mean, after a week or something, you have to wonder, right? You have to wonder, like, oh, man, I really haven't seen anyone who doesn't look like me walk in the room.
Yeah.
But so what I love about these algorithms, this algorithm discourse, is what we're realizing is there's so many ways in which we're harmed and we don't realize it.
Yeah, and so many ways in which we're doing harm and we don't realize it.
And the thing about these is that algorithms are so much more easier to accuse of sexism than people.
Yeah.
What I mean is, like, if you say, if you have an algorithm in front of you and a little computer and you say, I want to know if you're sexist, all you do is you kind of, you show it one resume. You then just change the name maybe to a female presenting name, or you change the college to be a traditionally female liberal arts college or something, and you say, hey, nothing else changed but that, and now you're changing your mind.
They did that, a study of professors where they sent graduate student resumes and the same resume with different names. And they published what the names were, and it was very clearly, the race and the gender were all very clearly coded in all the names. And they found that they could actually prove that professors as a whole.
Right.
They couldn't prove one professor, because if you send one professor 30 resumes.
Right.
That professor is going to be like, these are all the same. But
exactly.
They did find that as a whole, society, very racist.
Well, exactly. But,
and sexist.
Exactly. But, so what's harder about that case, though, in the mass, of we can know that Amazon as a whole, the department, is sexist, but what do you do about it? How do you change a whole hiring department from being a bunch of sexist people to not? That's a complicated question.
Yeah.
People have been studying this question for years, and if anyone has an answer, please call me and let me know, because it's a difficult thing, because it's people. People are complicated.
Yeah, the proposals I've seen have basically been get people of color, get women in the room, look around the room and see who is or isn't there. So hire people with disabilities, hire women, hire people of color, hire queer people, make the conscious effort. However, having had advocated for that in a previous company I worked for, and heard just the backlash from someone who was trying to be better.
No, it's complicated, but this is what I like about algorithms. Algorithms are not really complicated. There's this aura around algorithms that I just find bizarre, that they're this extraordinarily complicated. You hear the term black box, we have no idea what they're doing. But in the same way, people are extraordinarily complicated, but we make quick and easy sense of people, right? I have no idea what other people are thinking. I have no idea how they're wired, where they came from, anything about them, but yet we kind of make sense of them.
I don't know. I find people terrifying.
But so what I like about using algorithms in these contexts is that they're bad in the sense they perpetuate things, but they're good, I think, in the way that they make us aware of the things that we are perpetuating. So Safia Noble's book, on search engines, for example, where she demonstrated if you search the term doctor in Google image search, you'll see a bunch of smiling white old men.
Yep.
Where now if you do that search, you won't, and it's interesting how they do that. But what's wonderful about these kind of examples, I find, is I think they give confirmation to people, one, that these things are true.
Yeah.
So first of all, I think that there's a deep benefit as a society to be aware of the fact that just based on the way we behave, an unbiased algorithm picks up our biases easier than it learns to pick up a cat versus a dog.
Yep.
So the extent of our bias is extraordinarily deep. The second component of it is that they're trackable, traceable, and what I like to call triable. So just as I was saying about the hiring algorithm, we can put algorithms on trial. They don't lie in court. They're honest in court. They say exactly what they do.
And they won't say, hey, you've sent me 3 of the exact same resume with different names.
Exactly. And I find this empowering. So on the one hand, while I try to advocate against using algorithms in harmful situations, on the other hand, I think that there's a benefit to them. Even if they're currently perpetuating a certain level of bias that we think is wrong, perfect. Put it on display, show us all, and then show us how you're going to make it better. Versus what often happens in reality is that upon recognizing, someone in society recognizes algorithms are perpetuating some bias that we don't like, what people do is then they get rid of the algorithm. So Amazon got rid of their bias algorithm, but are they doing much better? Now we have no way of knowing.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I don't like to use too much inductive logic here, which is just to say they're going to do the same thing.
I've always found that culture fit is code for...
No, 100%.
So my next question is, I guess, jumping off of when you said that algorithms were decently simple. There are a lot of keywords that I don't really understand. What is deep learning?
So deep learning is just the same idea as pattern recognition, except deep learning was this term, buzzword, essentially, that came out of this use of neural networks. And so neural networks are this mathematical formula for making predictions that are trained in supercomputers on big data. And they're effectively just a complicated form of linear regression. And they're deep because it's essentially kind of like doing a linear regression on a linear regression on a linear regression. And so,
so shallow learning would just be one linear regression?
Exactly. I mean, all these buzzwords are just kind of slices of the same puzzle. I mean, all these things are just trying to create a function that acts like the data acts. And the difference between a lot of them is just what type of data do you have? Images? Do you have text? Do you have, LiDAR? And that's where you can start to see differentiation. But they all are kind of the same thing. And the fact that a lot of people try to sell them differently is, in my opinion, a bit of a marketing thing. Yes, as themselves the biggest self-perpetuators of marketing.
Hey, you've written grants, I assume.
I have. And I meant all the novelties that I said in them.
So now let's move on to the applications of your artificial intelligence research, specifically synthetic biology. So what is synthetic biology? So
synthetic biology is this idea of using biological stuff to solve our problems. So traditional engineering uses things like concrete or, back hundreds of thousands of years ago, like bronze or iron or just trees.
Stone, wood.
Yeah, these kinds of things. This is how engineering is. And then, of course, as we got smarter, as Louis Pasteur came around, as we learned about small molecules that we used for drugs, like Advil, Tylenol, we started doing engineering to solve our biological problems with those things. Those are still kind of, inorganic or some organic. And now we're thinking about, what if we use some of our own pieces to serve things that we have to do? So we're made mostly of proteins. So, why don't we use proteins to make a little factory, say, to manufacture insulin? Or why don't we create these gigantic proteins that just swallow up all the bacteria?
So when I hear synthetic bio, I should just think modern medicine.
In some sense, modern medicine has been doing synthetic biology for a long time. So when we think about
Or just medicine.
Yeah, well, but it's bigger than that. I mean, so synthetic biology encompasses also the idea of using biology to solve our engineering problems. So if we want to build, say, a factory, does it need to be built out of iron and steel, or can it be built out of cells?
What are the ethics of a factory that is alive?
That's a complicated question. But, synthetic biology comes with great risks that have been well studied for many years. I mean, one of the biggest things is just the unknown of the whole thing. So when you're messing with biology, when you're creating things, one of the biggest threats that you face is that biology reproduces. So if you make a factory out of steel, it's only actually going to crumble. It's not really going to go anywhere else, right? But
if you make a factory out of trees, you're going to have a lot of seeds.
Right, but those seeds are just going to grow that same tree. The problem is if we make some weird type of cell that's like, say, producing some weird chemical that we use for, I don't know, whatever, for making new, I don't know, what do kids like these days? The squishy stuff. Play-Doh.
So, I've met kids.
so we make up bacteria that produces like, I don't know, like it eats some like sugars and it spits out some like Play-Doh material. Right? And well, those things, they reproduce. That's what's nice about them also. Yeah. It's like it's self-sustaining, they reproduce, we just feed it a little bit and it reproduces. But then, it left the lab. Now some kid has a Play-Doh producing bacteria in his stomach. And now, what do? Oh, that Play-Doh producing bacteria just developed antibiotic resistance. Now, all of our children have gigantic wads of Play-Doh in their stomach, and we can't kill the bacteria. So that's where the risks of synthetic biology get complicated. I mean, this is the whole GMO debate of like, well, if we just alter tomatoes a little bit, then all the tomatoes in the world will become altered. And like, what if this alteration then mutates to become like poisonous and then we die? Those are the risks. But of course, we know from things like climate change that we're always facing biological risks. Always.
Bringing up the GMO debate, what is the difference between altering a tomato to make it a better tomato and, say, selective breeding? For example, like, my puppy is a GMO. Like, she doesn't just happen.
Right, exactly.
Lots of generations of purposeful breeding led to the perfect puppy, who is mine.
And I think that's a wonderful question. I mean, I don't have an answer for it. I mean, one way you might think about it, I'll give you a couple, is you could think of all these things as just technology that was developed naturally. So in the same way that humans naturally began to domesticate animals through what maybe some critic we had in the room might call natural, right? They say that was natural, right? It was okay for early humans to domesticate animals.
Fun fact, there is more and more evolutionary biology evidence that humans did not domesticate dogs, that wolves domesticated themselves because humans were where all the easy food was. And modern studies trying to replicate the domestication of wolves or their predecessors into dogs have failed like repeatedly and dramatically. And
we're talking about the difference between selective breeding and genetically modified organisms.
Yeah.
One might think of them along a different axis, which might be along maybe an economic one. So you might think that selective breeding is maybe a cultural tradition in some sense. There's like, I don't know, the American Kennel Association, there's kind of this whole thing about pedigree and things, which I had no opinion on. It's an interesting practice for sure. And then there's kind of like gigantic big agriculture biotechnology companies that charge farmers an arm and a leg for seeds that they make not reproduce new seeds. So these crops, like they have to buy new seeds every year.
Honestly, if I could buy a puppy pre-spayed, I would have chosen that. Getting Cece spayed was traumatic for me. She was fine after 3 days. So worried every time she tried to jump on the furniture. So, yeah, I guess, is it more ethical then to make the seeds that don't reproduce so you know that whatever mutation won't be able to get out? Or is that less ethical because what you're basically doing is trapping your audience into buying the seeds from you? You're giving yourself a monopoly.
And I'd probably push back on the first thing you said a little bit, because the question is also, how do they really know it doesn't reproduce? I mean, maybe they've done it once, they tested it twice. There's this question also of gene transfer, which is a weird field that I really don't know much about how genes and plants kind of mingle I'm not going to say much more. This is not my area.
Okay, we can move on. So getting back to your research and tying that artificial intelligence into that synthetic biology, how do you use artificial intelligence in COVID-19 research, for example?
Yeah, so I'd say a big chunk of my research is in what's called drug discovery. So drug discovery is an area of like pharmaceutical chemistry where we try to find drugs for our problems. And so one pressing problem is finding a drug that will stop COVID, SARS-CoV-2, from replicating. So in my research, how this is played is essentially like, the way I like to think about it is fishing.
Okay.
So there's a sea of molecules out there. There's so many different molecules out there. Estimates are that there's 10 to like the 67 possible different molecules that we can theoretically theorize, whatever that means.
That's so many zeros.
That's a lot of zeros. It's more than all the things that people often cite. Stars in the universe, grains of sand. It's an unimaginable number. And so I like to think about it as fishing, which is that there's this protein inside of SARS-CoV-2 that replicates it. It's called a protease because it effectively takes in and starts copying things. And what the goal is to find a molecule that will sit next to that protein and then stop it. And so we have a sea full of molecules, and only a couple will probably work. So we have to cast our net and try to find it. So the way this works in traditional drug discovery is essentially we have like 1,000 molecules that we just test everything on. And so we test it on it, and then hopefully one like kind of barely maybe works, and then we like edit that one a lot, and we edit it more, and we edit it more, and we edit it more, and then eventually you have one.
Okay.
So the way my research works with AI is it said, well, can we just like predict kind of like which one might work? And then like let's just try it on like, I don't know, like maybe 1 billion.
So instead of guess and check, it's estimated guess and check, and then instead of real tests, it's simulated tests, which are cheaper and less likely to leave the lab.
Exactly. I mean, yeah. So it seems like COVID, like it takes months and months and months to get like a BSL-3 protocol, which is a type of biohazard lab, to even do testing on whole COVID. So before we even had, in this case at Argonne National Lab, before we even had our biohazard lab prepared to handle live COVID virus infected cells, we already had a bunch of molecular candidates lined up. And so one benefit to this is like the moment, March 2020 comes along, it's actually quite quick for us to do this kind of research, right? I mean, by June, I think we actually had a couple of candidate molecules that we still are working on in our hands.
Wow, that's really impressive. And it kind of shows the kind of good side of pattern recognition because I mean, it doesn't matter if you're racist against a molecule, I guess.
Well, it's actually a big question of research still. So one thing in training AIs is the same problem. So chemists, as I mentioned, have been working with the same set of molecules for the past 100 years. Why? Well, because you can only work with maybe 1,000 at most in your lab storage box, and because there's certain chemistries which are just easier to like work off of.
Okay.
Like I don't know, for chemists in the audience, you probably know doing synthetic chemistry is hard off of certain types of compounds, but easier off of others.
So the which 1,000 chemicals you have is more a matter of practicality than
exactly. So our
else.
models are biased towards those compounds because that's where all the data is. So that is actually a problem. The problem is generally called inductive bias, because the problem is there's this gigantic space of chemicals of which we've only really played around with the useful ones, but it might not be the case that just what's useful for us to work with are actually the ones that are really good for doing, for finding drugs. So there's actually a problem in AI research in general, which is finding all the biases that humans create.
Oh.
So it's a problem everywhere.
That's really interesting. So I guess we've talked about how bias in artificial intelligence is everywhere, and you can be biased against molecules.
Yes, you can.
But aside from that, what should everyone know about artificial intelligence that most people don't know?
I think people should know that it's really quite simple. I mean, I think you shouldn't be afraid to think about it, nor question it. I think some people hear the phrase artificial intelligence and immediately go to like this like robot that like kind of knows everything, like maybe a Star Wars like kind of
or Star Trek. Every time you see artificial intelligence in sci-fi, it's super complicated, often quite evil.
Yeah, that's not at all what AI looks like. I mean, AI is really as simple as the linear regressions that you did in statistics class. And if you recall for those of you who've taken the statistics test, they probably were not very good. And that's the reality of it. The way in which these things become good, become popularized, is a very fascinating area in like media studies research right now. Of like, what is AI hype? Of like, why is it hyped up as a thing? Like, I think just recently, even the Georgetown Center for like AI Ethics recently said that they're not using the word AI anymore. Like, they're refusing to call it anything intelligent because it's just confusing.
So what are they calling it? Like pattern recognition?
Yeah, something like this. They're calling it like statistical models.
That's really going to hurt them on getting grants.
It is going to hurt them as well. It's going to help them get their grants, but everyone else. But I mean, I think that there's a benefit for people to try to think about it a little bit and to grapple with it, because I think it helps them understand kind of what's happening in the space. It doesn't really help them form a solidaristic movement against it, but it definitely helps empower, I think.
Science and technology are often perceived as amoral and objective, and we've already talked about how artificial intelligence specifically is bias, because it's only recognizing human patterns, which are bias. But science as a whole is also done by scientists and can be very biased. We talk about that at great length in the video about fat phobia. In a presentation I watched of yours, you used the overpass example. If you've all seen Abigail Thorne's Philosophy Tube video, she uses that example as well to talk about how an overpass design affected the segregation of a city because buses couldn't fit under the overpasses, and lower income, especially people of color, disproportionately used the buses, so only wealthy people could go under the overpasses. Do you have any other examples that might...
Yeah, so fun fact on this example, it was originally written by Langdon Winner in his book, Do Artifacts Have Politics? His answer is yes, to let you know. And actually, Pete Buttigieg even mentioned this at a transportation secretary briefing of some sort. And it was a huge win for the field of science and technology studies. But there are plenty of examples like this all throughout the world. And if anything, I find it hard not to think of one that has politics. I mean, everything from the gates at universities to even the way that the tax systems are implemented, like the literal systems, kind of like the way in which tax forms are done, right? Like they're complicated, and complication comes with its own politics. In Europe, it's not complicated to file your taxes, for example.
Why does it cost so much money to file my taxes?
Well, exactly why. I mean, and that's a particular choice of artifact, and a particular choice that people make. And in general, all decisions come with some sort of politic, right? I mean, every choice that you make. And if you don't think the choice you're making has one, ask, why do I have to make this choice? And who am I making this choice for? And then you're instantly already then in a political situation.
So I mentioned the most recent Philosophy Tube video, but you studied philosophy, and I have you trapped in a room with me. So I can ask this very dumb question. What is the difference between like the ethics of synthetic biology and transhumanism? Because I don't know the difference between those two things.
So transhumanism is a set of ideas from a bunch of different theorists, I'd say. And there's a couple different ways to say it, because I don't want to offend any one of the sects of the transhumanism. So one way of putting transhumanism is there's this idea that, well, if you take natural selection super seriously, then there's this whole idea of, well, what's after humanity? What comes after us? Are we just here to serve evolution? And if we are, maybe robots are the next thing. Like, who says evolution or Mother Nature or whatever, the consciousness of the spirit of the earth has to look like biology? Maybe the next thing is just a bunch of computers that we stick around and reproduce, just the way that, like, I don't know, like we still use cows to reproduce. In the sense that we eat them, like not any other sense.
I was going with you. I wanted to see where you were going with that.
No, in the sense of like, there's all these other things that we need ourselves to support our own growth. So what if we're just like, I don't know, the monkeys who run the computer system, right? And maybe that's the idea. So the idea of transhumanism there is that there's something beyond us that we might want to look to. This is also where you might get an idea of the cyborg. right? In that sense. So transhumanism is a kind of a different field in some sense. Synthetic biology, I don't think is near transhumanism in some sense. I think synthetic biology is an engineering problem, which I keep reiterating.
But specifically, like the ethics of synthetic biology.
So the ethics of synthetic biology. So transhumanism isn't an ethical study. So transhumanists are just people who think that this is true. So they're just trying. So they're just sitting around trying to prove that like consciousness is emergent. Like I don't know, maybe humans are just big cells, and like the forest or something is like the being. I'm really being mean to transhumanists. I'm a bit on purpose. But yeah.
Please leave comments on this video. Hey, starting fights is good for engagement.
Well, yeah, you know. I don't think transhumanists watch videos, but...
Transhumanists don't have spare time.
Yeah.
You heard it here first.
Yeah, and there's another related field to that too, in case someone is actually interested, just to throw them something, called cybernetics, which is this other idea that treats information in this kind of weird discrete sense, like information as being like bits of like ones and zeros, like signals, that treats that as kind of a foundational element of worldliness.
How do you quantize information?
So Claude Shannon wrote a whole book on how to do this. It's called Information Theory. And you quantize it just by bits, ones or zeros.
Okay, I understand, like, letters can become ones or zeros. Like, you can write the alphabet in binary. That's how computers work. But you can then combine those letters into words, and I can understand, like, a word as a set of ones and zeros and all the definitions of that word being a set of sets of ones and zeros. Think about a poem. Like a good poem that's well written. It has dozens of different meanings for every word, 4 or 5 different interpretations just on a first cursory glance. Also, say this poem has a bunch of cultural significance because it was written by William Shakespeare. I'm not thinking of a specific poem. And someone reading that poem might be nostalgic for the first time they heard that sonnet or whatever performed. How do you capture... Like, I know you're just getting more and more ones and zeros for the most part, but, like, nostalgia is information. Feelings are information. Like, we can also talk about a conversation and how body language works and tone of voice.
I'm hearing the following, and this is among a bunch of different philosophical camps you asked this question to, but it's actually really complicated how you parse out what you mean by information. So information, in the kind of traditional cybernetic sense, would see this poem as just being a set of symbols, like letters, like a collection of letters. That's the information. And maybe they might argue that you're a person who comes with information in your head, that you then look at that information, add it to that information, and somewhere in that intersection there, you produce that meaning. So the meaning of that poem doesn't come from the information in the poem itself, but it comes from your experience of being in the world and bringing with you all of that. To which, when those symbols meet those symbols in the back of your head, you get some phenomenon of, I understand this poem. I can interpret this poem.
That sounds like a really well-worded cop-out.
Well, and then there's other ways of interpreting it. I mean, according to Martin Heidegger, in his early work, he thought that the only way in which we perceive the world is through our emotions, first of all, he said. And he went even a step beyond emotions. He said mood. So he said, first of all, you have moods. And how do you perceive things? Through your moods. And it's a pretty hard point to argue against, I have to say, as a moody person.
I feel kind of called out.
Right, no, but so in that way, well then what is information? But I do think that there's a way in which we can parse out information in that kind of sense of like there's text on page is information in some sense. Whether or not it's true, information is a completely different story, but it's information that's there. But I think you are right that there is some richness to interpreting that information that gets lost. But I think that that's an interpretive question. I don't think that it's an information question.
So we've talked about a lot of ethical questions and a lot of science questions. In practice, though, like aside from these reference studies, aside from these hypotheticals, how do you, on a day-to-day basis, or how would you suggest we, as people, some of whom are doing science, some of whom are doing engineering, some of whom are just trying to get through the day, How do you and we as people use these ethics day to day? How do we make science more ethical?
That's a big question. And that's very complicated. Because science comes from many different sources, right? One of the biggest things is that a lot of people don't realize the kind of machinery, the political machinery that's behind science, right? One of the most powerful things I think in science is agenda setting. What is funded, what is not. And those come from really national organizations mainly.
There's a joke in the astronomy community that there are actually 5 fundamental forces. The 4 fundamental forces, gravity, electromagnetic, strong and weak. But then there is the 5th fundamental force that rules them all, and that is grant funding.
Exactly. And so, one of the most powerful things I think is getting science back on some political radars. It's kind of science's worst nightmare in some sense, but I think there's a power to it. Why do we study certain things? At the same time, there's, of course, the benefit in America has one of the strongest basic science programs. Why? Well, because we mainly treat it as this kind of thing that no one touches. So there has to be a very delicate balance between funding the kinds of basic science work that's, fundamental in some sense, right? Like, I don't know, whether or not we're studying the way telomeres in cells pull apart different strands of DNA, maybe shouldn't be a political question. Maybe, that's just good work that someone needs to do. But maybe what diseases that we're studying and how we're studying them might be a political question in some sense. It's a question of we have finite resources and we have a lot of people with a lot of opinions and a lot of problems.
Okay, so but here's the thing. Curing malaria seems a lot harder than curing male pattern baldness. And there's a lot more money to be made for curing male pattern baldness. So why should we put all of our research money into malaria? Because, capitalism.
Well, that's a different problem. I don't know how to solve capitalism. The best way to do that is go to the streets, I guess. Yeah, you heard it here. Also this question of what you said is interesting, that it's easier to cure male pattern baldness versus curing malaria. The question of easiness is always a question of will. It's fascinating to me that now, just this year, we have in clinical trials an HIV vaccine. Where did this come from all of a sudden? Oh, it came from the COVID mRNA vaccine research. But if we recall, mRNA vaccine research...
It's been around since the 80s, hasn't it?
Has been around since, I don't know if that far back, but I know at least 10 years ago. At least it's been there since. To which there's just no one thought of it, no one felt like doing it, the money wasn't there. But now, all of a sudden, we're like, oh yeah, by the way, why don't we go do that?
Why don't we just cure AIDS? Well, no reason to do that decades ago.
Right. And this is where the agenda setting part comes.
How do we set the agenda better?
Well, so one way is being informed, which is speaking to the choir.
I'm trying to inform more people, so yeah.
Right. So one
tell
problem.
People to watch my videos, I guess.
Well, I think one problem in science communication, not to come for what you do, but
please do. Science communication is a mess.
So my biggest problem with the whole thing of science and the way it's communicated is that we always just communicate what we've done, but we rarely ever communicate what's possible. And that's, of course, you cannot ask a bunch of people who don't do this every day, hey, what do you want done? They have no idea what's possible. Zero.
Yeah.
While meanwhile, the person who invented mRNA vaccines, I guarantee you, over dinner with some red wine and some, I don't know, fancy event or something, be like, oh, yes, this could cure...
Yeah, this would totally cure HIV.
No, but these are the types of conversations I had, and I'm like, wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. I do think we present science, like when we're teaching science, we present it as... Here are the things that are true. We know them because evidence, trust science, yeah. And on this channel, I am trying to kind of show the scientific process a little more and show, hey, this is how we know these things. This is why we know these things. And I end most of my videos by saying that further study is needed because there are all of these outstanding questions. I had a video about black holes, and at the time that video was released, we still didn't have a picture of the Milky Way's black hole, Sagittarius star. There's so much out there still to be discovered. I guess if we're talking about COVID, we can talk about how a lot of people were really upset that the CDC's recommendations kept changing. And we've all kind of grappled with it and are getting better at understanding why the CDC's recommendations keep changing. But I think for a lot of us, it was kind of jarring to see the scientific process play out in real time. And it's like, oh, why is the CDC saying no masks and now all of a sudden we do have to wear masks? Well, the situation changed and the information changed. So we changed.
And I think it's important too that I don't think that trust in science has to come only from the idea that science is not political. I think that one could acknowledge that the CDC was doing politics.
Yeah.
Even in them flipping.
Mask availability mattered. Whether they thought they could enforce a mask mandate mattered.
Right, and I think that, you know, a lot of times in science communication nowadays, you're seeing this like backlash against trust and also this like kind of like throwing yourself into it also at the same time, and both seem kind of suspicious. At both ends, you're kind of like, what is this? Trust in this thing no matter what? Like, so help me God? Or like, who are these kinds of people? And like, what are they talking about?
Yeah.
But I think that there's a trust in which can come also from the recognition that, of course, this is political in many ways. I dare you to find something not. And also, while at the same time saying, but there is a process to it in which it does work. One thing I like to think about often is how many inventions we've invented that we still use today that were invented under the wrong model of the atom. I love thinking about this question of how many things do we have today that we nearly all use all the time that were invented under completely ridiculous modern scientific models. I mean, just like the weirdest facts these things were invented under, and we still use them.
And they work.
So the question of something being true eternally and timelessly...
I mean, we still use current going backwards. We still have the flow of current against electron drift.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, economics uses charts backwards. Science is getting better, but it worked.
Most of my point being is, like, it doesn't need to be the case either that you have the right thing for something to be effective. Like, you don't need to have the thought dead center for something to work, right? I mean, like, the extent to which COVID vaccines are not effective on one hand. Like, on the one hand, they're kind of not. Like, they're not doing all they need to do. But on the other hand, they're extraordinarily important and helpful.
Yeah.
And I don't think that one has to have, like, I don't know why some people can't sit with both of these thoughts at the same time.
Yeah. Using me as a personal example. On the one hand, I'm vaccinated and I still got COVID. So we know that the vaccine is not completely effective at preventing us from contracting Omicron. On the other hand, I had like a mild fever and cold symptoms for 3 days and then I felt fine. And I tested negative after like 6 days. So we know that vaccinated, I was a lot less sick than I would have been. So we know that the vaccines are incredibly effective. Like, those two things can both be true.
And also, too, there's a separate question of, like, why does it matter? And I
don't want to die.
Well, no, but when I think about it from a standpoint of thinking about society, of like, we live in a kind of culture in America where from the Enlightenment, where the idea is like every person should be able to make their own decisions for themselves based on the facts presented to them that they calculate. And that's the ideals in this country. But it's not like that in other countries, or it doesn't need to be like that also. For example, most parents who aren't anti-vaxxers and before that kind of whole era, when their kids get vaccinated, really don't ask too many questions. The extent to which it's kind of like, well, this is what you do. That's a norm. They're not even doing it because it's like, are you sure that the shingles vaccine is effective?
Hypothetically, in a field that doesn't deal with humans at all, or even life at all, astrophysics, what are the ethical dilemmas in that field? Besides the whole, like, building new telescopes that leads to a massive carbon footprint and environmental destruction when we have loads of archival data that we could just use. Maybe we're extending the legacy of colonialism, especially considering the Mauna Kea situation. Like, say for theoretical astrophysicists who, yes, collaborate with observational astrophysicists, but basically how can my wife and I be completely pure ethically?
Well, I don't have a good answer because I really don't know much about space and I don't like to think about it too much. It's a bit too existential. But one thing that comes to my mind, and this is applicable generally to other fields, is, why do you want to know? And what power comes with knowing? And what power comes with being wrong? And who are you answering to? And for something like space exploration, there is an ethics to knowledge, I think. I think, what does it mean for us to know more about it? What does it mean for that to become a central piece of knowledge that we say teach children to think about? It's hard to imagine what the effects of knowledge are from the point of where you are today. But we do know that with all knowledge comes a different social world. The world in which we are just a planet amongst the gigantic universe of we don't know what, versus we are a planet in the universe of some things we do know now what's there. Those things can be anything from frightening to scary to friendly to war creating to, as you said, colonialist.
So you asked a lot of hypothetical questions, and I'm just going to answer all of them except one with space is cool and space is really fucking cool, respectively. Except for the one about who do I answer to, and that is my wife. It's so hard for me to really answer that. Like, why do we care about the origins of the universe? I think it's kind of just baked into us as humans, that kind of yearning for knowledge. Like, we have, like, human cultures develop religion. And all human cultures, even ones that aren't religious, have a creation myth. Like, you can call the Big Bang Theory a creation myth. I personally think it has evidence backing it up, more so than other creation myths. However, depending on what you see as evidence, you could disagree with that, and that we can agree to disagree, because that's not what this video is about.
Well, but even in there, too, there's an ethical question, I think, too, of like, I mean, it's not ethical, obviously, but you said it yourself, right? I mean, why do space exploration? Well, maybe your personal reason might be developing some type of story. And Heidegger, I hate to bring up Heidegger twice, Heidegger would just say, these kinds of stories help us avoid thinking about our own death.
Yeah, can we move on? I really don't want to think about my own death. We'll move on to, I guess, questions about you. You've studied both computer science and philosophy at the graduate level. I tried balancing physics and theater at the undergrad level, and I remember how that was. So I guess my question is, what is your preferred method of ingesting caffeine?
Espresso. I probably have like 5 or 6 a day. I recommend if you're a grad student, invest early.
Invest early, invest often.
Make sure you get an echocardiogram while you're young, just to make sure it's all good.
Do you like chocolate-covered espresso beans?
No, I really just...
Because you can snack on them constantly. And if you just keep eating them, you never have to sleep.
I'll have to try that.
Yeah. They're like a happy snack that makes you very awake. I guess my last question is, what should I have asked you that I didn't?
Well, one question you maybe should have asked me, you raised a lot of questions and you answered none of them. So,
yeah.
So what's the point of your questions?
Well, I didn't want to prey on your insecurity, but you just brought it up, so thank you for that. Follow-up to that question. During this interview, you've raised a lot of questions, and you've challenged me to think about things, and you've challenged our audience to think about things in new ways and to question a bit more. But you have answered none of our questions, questions that you yourself raised. And it feels like you're setting yourself up for a softball there, and then you just kind of whiff it. What's the point? Why should we care, and what good are you?
Well, it's a question of what's the role of academia and of knowledge production, I think. And I don't think the role of it should be to set a lot of the answers. I think it should be to raise the right questions and to get people thinking, to get people looking in new directions. And the functioning of our society and of our democratic institutions should be to help sort those out. I don't think my thoughts on what's right or what's wrong should determine what's right or what's wrong.
You're leaving it as an exercise to the reader, aren't you?
I am.
Answer philosophy is left as an exercise to the reader. It'll be on your homeworks. Please read chapter 14. I like that. Actually, no, I hate that, but my wife will find it hysterical.
I'm definitely one of the only scientists in the room who will raise a bunch of questions and then leave happily. My colleagues find me really quite annoying in meetings. My
wife did early in her Ph.D. receive some pretty key advice that is very counterintuitive. Apparently, it is much better for your career, even in astronomy, to ask a question and start a new field of study that gets people excited than it is to answer a question. Because if there's a whole field of study trying to answer a big question, and you come up with a paper that answers it, all done, packing up, go team, I win, we can go home, nobody's going to cite your paper because there's no further work to do. But if you ask a question that gets people really excited and thinking, everybody is going to reference your work as the reason for their work, and you will have started a new field rather than ended one.
Did she take the Little Red Schoolhouse by chance?
I don't know what that is.
Okay, well, there's only one other person who I've ever met who gives this advice. And his name's, he's a writing professor here at the university.
You're going to get, hopefully, cited a lot, and hopefully you won't answer any of those questions, because that would be devastating to your career. Thank you so much, Austin, for sitting down with us. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Have a great day. Remember that science is always a process, and further study is always needed. Astra out.
Astra, to the stars, to the stars.